I grew up in a very conservative household. My mother was a strict woman who hated almost everything, but what she despised most were video games. I can still remember the look of disgust on her face whenever she yelled the words, "Stop playing those cursed video games, Ellie, they'll rot your brain." This wasn't an uncommon belief among parents in the 90s, and my mother, who already distrusted most forms of entertainment, was certain that video games were created by demons to corrupt the minds of children. She always took every opportunity she had to remind me that the video games I enjoyed playing were the tools of the devil, used to poison young minds and pull them away from God. But I never listened. My uncle was a PC game collector, and he shared his love for video games with me from a very young age. The weekends I spent at his house playing the latest titles he'd picked up from his PC were the highlight of my childhood. Video games felt like an escape for me back then, as they were the only ways I could vent and forget my overbearing mother. However, my love for video games eventually led me down a very morbid path when I turned 12, as I realized that there may have been some truth to my mother's warnings. While I didn't know it at the time, one of the cursed video games I loved playing ended up rotting my brain just like my mother had said. I kept telling myself that I was just a kid, but that's no excuse for the unspeakable things I did. I never could have imagined that playing a simple game could significantly alter my brain chemistry and drastically change the trajectory of my life. It all happened after my 12th birthday party. I was spending the weekend at my Uncle Hank's place, and I was so excited to check out the new games he'd bought. I remember bolting to his monitor as soon as I arrived, and I went on to play through some of the new games in his collection, like Jazz Jackrabbit, Myst, and SimCity 2000. After sifting through his new titles, I revisited some of my favorite games as I looked up King's Quest VII and the Sonic & Knuckles collection. The hours flew by, and it wasn't long before it got dark outside. My uncle made spaghetti and garlic bread for dinner that night, which was my favorite meal at the time. We then ate some cookies and ice cream for dessert while we watched my favorite movie, Clueless. I thanked my uncle for dinner once the movie was over and for making my birthday weekend so special. But that's when he told me he had one final surprise before I went to bed. I can still remember how excited I was when my uncle gifted me his old PC with a ribbon on it. The PC had already been set up on a smaller desk in the corner of the room. He told me he'd gotten a new system and didn't want the old one to go to waste, so he thought it would make a perfect gift. I gave my uncle a hug and thanked him for everything again before going to bed, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the gift I'd just received, and I was so grateful to finally have my own PC that I could use to play video games whenever I wanted. I snuck out of my room late that night and spent a couple of hours playing King's Quest VII until I felt sleepy. Before going to bed, I took a little detour as I snuck into the basement where my uncle kept his PC game collection, and I made my way to a tall wooden cabinet with a glass door at the back of the room. My uncle had plastered a silly sticker on the locked cabinet door that read, "No Ellies allowed," as he always used to tell me I could play every game in his collection except the ones behind this glass door. My uncle was a responsible man, and he constantly made sure I was never exposed to any M-rated games that I wasn't supposed to be playing. However, it felt like the games in the large cabinet were calling out to me whenever I visited my uncle, and I was an extremely curious 12-year-old. I'd always seen where he used to hide the keys that opened the case, and even though I felt bad for breaking my uncle's trust, I opened the case and picked a game. There were several titles locked away behind the glass door. I remember seeing games like Phantasmagoria, Dark Seed 2, I Have No Mouth, and I Must Scream, and The Seventh Guest. But out of the many CD-ROMs in the cabinet, there was one particular title that stood out to me. This game was called Harvester, and I was weirdly drawn to its box. The game's cover art depicted a hooded man who had soulless eyes and was holding a sheath. The game's title, Harvester, was printed in jagged dark crimson letters across the box's cover. 3 discs were stacked neatly inside. I didn't know why, but it felt like they were speaking to me, asking me to play them. After locking the cabinet behind me, I slid disc 1 into the CD-ROM drive and pushed the tray closed. After the opening sequence played out, I took control of the game's titular character, Stephen Mason. Stephen is an 18-year-old amnesiac who wakes up with no memories in a small Texas farming town called Harvest. The only thing Stephen knows for sure is that the year is 1953. As he goes on to explore the town of Harvest, he is manipulated and forced to carry out several violent, morbid, and gruesome acts by the town's cult, the Order of the Harvest Moon. It didn't take me long to realize why my uncle was so adamant whenever he warned me never to touch the games locked behind the glass door. Harvester's full-motion video segments contained some of the most graphic and disturbing scenes I'd ever seen. I could feel my childhood innocence dying, and even though I was terrified, I couldn't stop playing the grotesque point-and-click adventure game. I played through a majority of Harvester's story until the early hours of the morning when I heard my Uncle Hank getting up from his bed. I quickly turned off the PC and returned the game's box so my uncle wouldn't notice anything. But I kept all 3 discs and hid them away in my bag. I don't know why I decided to steal the discs from my uncle's collection, as I was still petrified from playing Harvester that night. But despite my fear, there was also this little voice in the back of my head urging me to take the discs home and finish the game. I didn't say anything to my uncle when he asked why I was up so early that morning. And even though I'd been completely scared by Harvester's graphic scenes, I tried my best to act as normal as I could until the weekend was over. Despite my mother's protest, my uncle was able to convince her to allow him to set up the PC he'd gifted me on an old desk in our basement. My uncle had also gifted me a handful of age-appropriate games before assuring my mother that these titles were rated kids to adults by the ESRB and that there were no graphic elements or gore or any other mature themes. My mother reluctantly agreed to let me keep the games as she felt it was rude to decline, but she told me I could only play these games for 1 hour a day, and she often watched me like a hawk whenever I turned on the PC. I was only allowed to play the games that had been reviewed by my mother, as she always peered over my shoulder, making sure I wasn't exposed to any graphic content. But I would sneak out late at night to continue playing Harvester while she was asleep. I didn't notice until it was too late, but I had begun to disassociate whenever I put the stolen Harvester discs into the CD-ROM drive. I would completely immerse myself in the small Texas town of Harvest, and my reality slowly began to blur every time I put myself in Stephen Mason's shoes. All this eventually led to early onset psychosis, as I began to hear the game's unsettling music in my head while daydreaming about committing violent acts, and it wasn't long before I started seeing him. It's really hard to explain what it was or how it happened, but I'd developed an imaginary friend called Steve. I'd had imaginary friends when I was a lot younger, but this time was different, as Steve was like a malignant tumor growing out of my neck like a conjoined twin. I've never been able to truly describe what Steve actually looked like, but he was essentially a rotting corpse holding a sheath. I couldn't make out his facial features as the skin on his face was peeling off, but he looked oddly similar to the hooded man on the Harvester's box. I can still recall the first time I began to notice him. I was terrified at first, as he had no body and his torso was growing directly out of my neck. But I eventually got used to it, as Steve had this strangely calming presence whenever he spoke. I also know this is going to sound strange, as the corpse growing out of my neck was imaginary, but I could still smell Steve's rotting flesh, and I could feel his hot breath against my ear whenever he spoke. He would whisper to me all day, urging me to cut open Luna, my neighbor's tabby cat. Luna was an orange shorthair who belonged to our elderly neighbor, Gladys. Luna had been adopted to keep Gladys company ever since her husband Richard had passed. I loved Luna, and I always brought her some food when Gladys wasn't home. But Steve urged me to cut off her paw so I could bury it in my backyard and wait for the harvest. I didn't know what this meant and tried to ignore him at first, but he was insistent. So one Saturday, I took my father's machete and lured Luna into my backyard. Following Steve's order, I mutilated the cat and took its paw. I then buried its corpse and buried its paw in a shallow hole that I would water every day. My memories from this period are all fragmented, since I would often disassociate to carry out these heinous acts. Steve's morbid requests only grew worse from there, and I found it difficult to ignore him. He would tell me to catch and decapitate a raven before burying its head in another hole. It was gruesome work, but I did what I was told. He then told me to poison the stray dog in the park and sever its tail. So I snuck out one evening, killed the dog, and took off its tail. After I'd carried out these horrific deeds, Steve would always urge me to stifle my emotions and do what needed to be done for the harvest. He would also remind me to bury the severed parts of these animals in my backyard and to water the spots to achieve an even greater harvest. I once asked him what this harvest was and why nothing was growing yet, but he urged me to be patient, as he said we would receive our yield in due time. After a few weeks, Steve told me the harvest was nigh, and we needed one final thing to reap the fruits of our labor. He told me to wait until my mother was deeply asleep and to get the kitchen knife and cut off 3 of her fingers. I told him I couldn't do it, but he said I should throw away my emotions as I had done before and take the final step toward reaching our harvest. Steve also reminded me how overbearing my mother was and how I deserved to take away the fingers she was always pointing in my face. So I agreed. I waited until the very late hours of the night before I entered my parents' room. My mother was lying next to my father, and I made sure she was sound asleep before taking out the large cleaver. With no hesitation, I took my mother's hand and brought down the sharp blade on her fingers. I was only able to completely sever her thumb, as the knife didn't go through her index and middle fingers. Nothing I could say would do justice to how I felt in that moment. And I can still remember the look of terror in my mother's eyes when she woke up screaming. It was a very distinct expression, as she was looking at her own child like I was a demon, while my father, who also had a terrified look on his face, tried to understand what was going on. It felt like an out-of-body experience as I picked up my mother's severed thumb before telling my horrified parents that I needed to do this for the harvest. After taking the knife from me, my father was able to rush my mother to the hospital, where she underwent urgent replantation, as the doctors did what they could to reattach the severed digit before it was too late. She'd lost a lot of blood, but they were able to stop the bleeding and reattach her thumb. That night changed the trajectory of my life forever, as I would spend the following years going to see more specialists, child psychologists, neurologists, and psychiatrists than I could remember. They called it a first episode psychosis. Later, someone said it was early onset schizophrenia. Another mentioned schizoaffective disorder. The specialists who examined me all spoke in cautious tones about how rare it was at my age. They also mentioned how the graphic scenes I'd seen in Harvester may have triggered something that was already there. They all assured my father that they would help me manage the voices through cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, as they tried everything they could to get rid of Steve. I was pulled from school and placed on heavy medication. My mother couldn't even look at me, as she was certain that I was possessed. My father, who was also terrified of me, was still a lot more considerate, and this put a lot of tension on my parents' marriage, as he often tried to defend me whenever my mother would suggest throwing me out of the house. It wasn't long before my mother moved out, as she didn't want to live under the same roof as me. This worsened my father's relationship with her, as even though he was horrified by what I'd done, he didn't want to abandon his only child. My uncle was also exiled from our family, as my mother blamed him for everything, and I was told I could never see him again. I also stopped playing video games, and my father monitored me very closely to avoid the same thing from happening again. My parents also tried to keep the situation from getting out, as they tried to frame my mother's injuries as an intruder's attack. But some people knew the truth, and there were a few locals who began spreading rumors of attempted matricide. So, we eventually had to move. It was a gradual process, but I eventually got better. I stopped seeing Steve, and I was able to return to a somewhat normal life. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't regret breaking my uncle's trust that night and opening that glass door. Even with all of the therapy, I still feel like I was cursed from the moment I picked up and played the video game Harvester. This curse still feels like a heavy burden on my back, because even if I can't see Steve on my neck anymore, there are days when I can still hear him whispering in my ear. His voice is faint, but he's telling me to cut off my fingers and plant them in the ground so I can finally achieve the great harvest. Digifex Interactive was a short-lived mid-1990s video game studio based in Dallas, Texas. The company was originally founded as Future Vision Inc. before being renamed Digifex Interactive in June 1996, which was the same year they released one of their most controversial titles, Harvester. The game drew backlash for its extreme violence and disturbing content. It received mixed reviews upon release, and it became a commercial failure. Harvester was also banned in Germany and other regions due to its extreme content. The controversial video game Harvester was created by Gilbert P. Austin, who wrote and directed the story. He later told the public that the idea had come to him in a flash, and he wanted the player to mull over whether they had internalized the over-the-top violence and surreal imagery of the game. Similar to many disturbing 90s point-and-click titles that were released at the time, many people believed Harvester was a cursed video game that made its players go mad. There were also several rumors that the video game was linked to an attempted matricide case that occurred during November 1996 in Monroeville, a suburb near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The attempted matricide case was never officially confirmed, as both the records and details of the supposed matricide from back then were extremely sparse. An anonymous story was later released online by a woman in 2007, claiming to be the little girl from the attempted matricide case, but no one was able to confirm if she was telling the truth, and her identity still remains a mystery. Despite being a commercial failure, Harvester went on to garner a cult following. There has also been some discourse in niche video forums about whether Harvester is actually one of the many cursed video games released in the 90s, or if the supposed curse that makes gamers run mad is just a hoax. There still hasn't been a definitive conclusion to the debate, but the general consensus is that most gamers should stay away from Harvester, as anyone who plays the game could risk losing their sanity forever.
It was 2:48 a.m., and I made a mistake that I don't think I can undo. I answered the call, because on the other end was me, Beat, and whatever it was. It knew exactly where I was sitting. Full cinematic horror narration. 7 to 8 minutes. I don't use my real name online anymore, but for this story, you can call me Ryan, because if I told you my real name, there's a chance you might get the next call. Soft breathing. 3 months ago, I took a freelance job. $500. All I had to do was sell my voice. Glitch hum. They sent me a link. The website was clean. Almost empty. No logo. No company name. Just one sentence. We build voices that never die. At the time, I thought it sounded cool. Now, it feels like a warning I should have listened to. The job was simple. Record 200 sentences, different emotions, happy, angry, scared, upload the files, get paid. But the sentences weren't normal. They felt targeted. I can see you. Don't answer the phone. They're already inside. At one point, I actually stopped recording and said out loud, "What is this even for?" But I needed the money. So I finished it, uploaded everything, and within 24 hours, I got paid. No follow-up, no questions, nothing. I thought that was the end of it, until 2 weeks later. Quiet tone, 2:48 a.m. My phone rang, unknown number. I almost ignored it. I really should have, but something told me to answer. Hello? Silence. 2 seconds. Then, Ryan? My stomach dropped. That was my voice. Not similar, not close. It was exact. Who is this? I asked. Heavy breathing through phone. On the other end, I could hear myself breathing. Then, don't hang up. Slight whisper closer. My hands started shaking. Stop messing with me. Who is this? Beat. Then it said, "They're watching you right now." I turned around instantly. Nothing. My apartment was empty, but for some reason, it didn't feel empty anymore. Click. The call ended. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone used my recordings. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Then my phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't for me. It was my sister. Her voice was shaking. "Ryan, why did you call me last night?" My chest tightened. I didn't. "Yes, you did," she said. You told me to check the back door." A cold feeling crept up my spine. "What happened?" I asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "It was already open." I drove to her place immediately. Checked everything. Nothing was missing. No signs of forced entry, but she was sure she locked it. And the call? It came from my number. That's when I knew. This wasn't a prank. I went back to the website. The one from the job? It was gone. Completely wiped. The link led to nothing. Even the email thread was gone. Like it never existed. I started digging, forums, Reddit, obscure threads, anything about voice cloning. That's when I found it. A post buried deep online. Title: "They're using voices to map behavior." The guy claimed this wasn't just about copying voices. They were training AI to become people, to predict reactions, to simulate real conversations, to manipulate. And for that, they didn't need actors. They needed subjects. I wanted to believe it was fake until I found the folder. It was on my laptop. A folder I never created, named /RYAN_MODEL_V2/ my hands went cold. I opened it. Inside were hundreds of audio files, each labeled with timestamps. I clicked one. It was me. My voice, but I had never said those words. Your door isn't locked. Turn around. Don't trust her. I felt sick. Then I saw the last file, dated tomorrow. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. Silence. 3 seconds. Footsteps. Slow. Getting closer. And then, my voice, panicked, breathing hard. I messed up. I shouldn't have taken that job. Then another voice, not mine. Close. Whispering. Too late. A loud crash. File ends. I slam my laptop shut. That was yesterday. Right now. I'm sitting in my apartment. Doors locked. Lights on. Phone in my hand. Because 5 minutes ago, I got a notification. Unknown caller. Voicemail received. I haven't listened to it yet, but the transcription already came through. It says, Ryan, don't open the door. 2-second pause. And the thing is, my door is locked, so tell me, very slow tone, why, soft metallic sound cue, did the handle start turning sound just move? From the inside?